Snow fell like quiet ash over the forgotten train station, a soft, merciful blanket that could not quite conceal the biting truth of winter in the high plains. The kind of cold that pressed loneliness deep into the bones and asked for nothing in return. It was Christmas Eve, a night meant for warmth and company, but the wind whistling through the warped awning of the platform spoke only of isolation. Arthur Morgan, a man of 30 years with solitude etched into the lines around his eyes, reined his steady mare, Bess, under the meager shelter. His breath fogged the air, a fleeting ghost in the twilight, as if his own lungs were uncertain they belonged anywhere anymore. He had ridden into the small town of Redemption for supplies and the familiar comfort of silence, a commodity more precious than gold in his solitary life on the ranch. Instead, he found a girl. She was asleep on a hard wooden bench, snow gathering like delicate blossoms in her dark, silken hair, as though the night itself had tried to claim her. She was small, almost swallowed by the vastness of the cold, wrapped in a tattered grey cheongsam, the fabric worn thin by too many departures and too few arrivals. The high collar and simple cut of the dress were a stark, foreign elegance against the rough-hewn timber of the station. Something in him paused, a stillness that went beyond mere surprise, as if a memory he didn't know he possessed had reached out and caught his sleeve. Who left a soul alone on a night like this? In a place like this? And what kind of profound fear taught a person to sleep so still, as if hoping to be mistaken for a shadow? He wondered as the snow kept falling, each flake a tiny, silent testament to the world's indifference. He did not wake her at first. To do so felt like trespassing on whatever fragile peace she had managed to find in the heart of the storm. Her face, pale and serene in the deepening gloom, was marked by a weariness that seemed far older than her years. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves for warmth, her body curled into the smallest possible space. With a quiet sigh that mingled with the winter air, Arthur slipped off his heavy wool coat. It was a gesture of pure instinct, the same one he used for an injured foal or a newborn calf. The coat, heavy with his own body heat, was a tangible piece of his life, of the warmth he hoarded in his remote cabin. He laid it over her shoulders with a care he rarely showed to anything human. The wool settled around her, a dark, protective shield against the encroaching frost. As the warmth seeped through her thin dress, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, the color of deep, still water, and for a moment, they held a startling, primal fear, sharp as a shard of glass. It was the terror of the hunted, the immediate assumption that any unexpected presence meant harm. He saw it flash, and then, just as quickly, it was softened by a flicker of curiosity, a slight widening of her gaze that allowed her to take a single, cautious breath. She looked at him not as a savior, but as another danger, perhaps one come to finish what the cold had begun. He lifted his hand slightly, palms open and empty, a gesture older than any language, a universal signal of peace. He had no words that could bridge the chasm of fear and suspicion in her eyes. So he offered the only thing he had. "Come home with me, if you want," he said. His voice was low and steady, unused to gentle things but trying its best. It was an offer, not a demand, a question, not a command. The wind died down for a moment, and the snow seemed to pause in its descent, listening. The entire world held its breath to see which way her life would turn. Her name was Mai, and she was 20 years old. She carried her story not in words, but in the guarded stillness of her posture, the way some people carry scars. Quietly, with no expectation of being asked or understood. The ride to his cabin was a silent passage through a world rendered in shades of white and grey. The world narrowed to the rhythmic crunch of Bess's hooves in the fresh snow and the surprising, steady warmth of Arthur's back before her. He had insisted she ride behind him, shielded from the worst of the wind. In that narrowing, in that small pocket of warmth and rhythmic sound, her memories began to rise in painful, crystalline fragments, like breath in the frigid air. She had been an orphan long before she understood the meaning of the word, sold by a starving family in a drought-stricken province of Guangdong. She was one of dozens packed into the dark, suffocating hold of a ship, promised a new life, a gold mountain in America. The reality was a form of bondage, indentured to a man named Mr. Chen, the formidable, unofficial mayor of the small, segregated corner of Redemption known as Chinatown. He had paid for her passage, and in his eyes, he owned her. Life in Mr. Chen's laundry and boarding house was one of endless, grueling work. Kindness was a mask worn only for appearances, and patience had learned the bitter shape of waiting for a debt that only seemed to grow. He was an older man, with eyes like chips of obsidian and a voice that was always coated in a layer of false courtesy. Recently, he had begun to speak of marriage. Not as a proposal, but as a transaction, a final settlement of her indenture. He spoke of it as if it were an act of charity, his voice thick with the unassailable certainty that her future belonged to him, because he had purchased it, and because he had decided it should. The night she ran had been colder than this one, fueled by a desperate, suffocating fear. The thought of being bound to him, of belonging to him in every way, was a terror that finally outweighed the fear of the unknown. She had slipped out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few coins she had managed to hide away over the years. She had meant to buy a ticket on the morning train, to anywhere, to disappear into the vastness of the country. But the station had been closed, the next train not due until after Christmas. The snow had started, and her courage, along with her warmth, had begun to fail her. Dignity had pulled her heart behind as fear pushed her feet forward. Arthur did not press her for her story. He did not ask questions. As they rode, the silence he offered felt like a form of shelter, not an absence of care. It was a quiet space for her to simply exist, and it made her wonder. In her experience, men, especially white men, took what they wanted. They did not offer coats or rides or a safe, unquestioning silence. Why would a man help her without asking for anything in return? The question was a small, cautious flame flickering in the frozen landscape of her distrust. His cabin waited at the edge of the trees, half buried in snow, a sentinel against the encroaching wilderness. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin, grey ribbon against the bruised twilight sky. It was a promise, a declaration that someone, somewhere, still believed in the power of warmth. Inside, the world was transformed. Firelight breathed a golden life against the rough-hewn pine walls, dancing over the simple, sturdy furniture. Frost traced delicate, feathery veins along the window panes, as if the cold itself were trying to remember what beauty looked like. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, coffee, and drying wool. It was the scent of a life lived alone, but it was not the scent of loneliness. It was the smell of self-sufficiency, of peace. Arthur gave her space in the ways that mattered most. After showing her the small cot on the far side of the hearth that he had prepared, he turned his back while she huddled by the fire, letting the warmth slowly, painfully, chase the deep chill from her bones. He set a bowl of hot stew on the small table and then busied himself with his own tasks, his movement slow and deliberate, letting the quiet settle between them without demanding it be filled with conversation. She ate ravenously, the simple meal of venison and root vegetables tasting like the most exquisite feast she had ever known. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt a fragile, tentative sense of safety. The storm could rage outside, the world could continue its relentless spin, but within these four walls, shielded by the quiet strength of this strange man, she was simply a young woman getting warm by a fire. Days later, when the storm had passed and the world was draped in a blinding, pristine white, they rode into town together. The fragile peace of the cabin was shattered the moment they entered the main street of Redemption. Whispers followed them like drifting snow, insidious and cold. Men who had previously nodded to Arthur in greeting now looked away, their gazes hardening with suspicion. Women, clutching their shawls tighter, lowered their voices as Mai passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Her very existence beside him was a question they did not want asked aloud. Sheriff Thomas Hale met them outside the general store. He was a man who wore his authority like a well-oiled holster, his politeness a thin veneer over a core of rigid, unyielding prejudice. He addressed Arthur, but his eyes kept flicking to Mai, assessing her as one might assess a stray animal. "Arthur," the sheriff began, his tone deceptively casual. "Town's a bit on edge. Christmas and all. Not used to new faces." "She needed help, Sheriff," Arthur replied, his voice flat, offering no further explanation. "Help is one thing," Hale said, lowering his voice. "But you know how people are. They value peace and order. Some things, well, they're better kept separate. For everyone's sake." The implication was as clear as the winter air. Mai heard her humanity reduced to an inconvenience, a disruption to their peace and order. She felt the familiar, cold weight of being seen not as a person, but as a problem. She drew into herself, her gaze falling to the snow-covered ground, wishing she could disappear. Yet, it was in the small, unspoken moments back at the cabin that something new and delicate began to grow between them. It was in the way Arthur, noticing the worn, thin soles of her cloth slippers, sat by the fire one evening and meticulously repaired them with a piece of soft leather, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. It was in the way Mai, seeing his hands chapped and raw from the cold, pressed a warm, damp cloth to them, her touch hesitant but firm. They were learning each other's rhythms without needing to name what they were becoming. He would leave a cup of hot tea for her by the fire in the morning, and she would take his wet clothes and hang them to dry without being asked. It was a language of quiet gestures, of mutual care that slowly, cautiously, began to build a bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. One evening, as she sat humming a soft, sad melody from her homeland, Arthur paused in his work of mending a leather bridle. He didn't speak, but simply listened, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room, thicker and warmer than before. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice rough. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "It is a song about a river that flows to the sea," she explained softly. "About finding your way home." He nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. "You're safe here, Mai," he said, the words a simple, solid promise. And in that moment, she believed him. Their fragile peace was shattered one night by the sound of a horse outside, its heavy hooves breaking the pristine stillness of the snow-covered land. Fear, cold and immediate, crept back into the cabin on careful hooves. Arthur rose slowly, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of the axe leaning by the door. Mai's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The knock on the door was sharp and imperious. Arthur opened it a crack, his body blocking the view. Standing on the porch, his face a mask of cold fury in the moonlight, was Mr. Chen. He was flanked by two rough-looking men Arthur recognized as hired muscle from the saloon. "I have come for my property," Chen said, his voice slicing through the cold air. He did not look at Arthur, his dark eyes were fixed on Mai, who stood frozen by the hearth. "She's not property," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "She's a guest in my home." Chen let out a short, humorless laugh. "She is my ward. My responsibility. There are papers. An indenture. She owes me a debt." He spoke of rights and promises, of papers and power, his words twisting her life into a simple matter of accounting. "The debt is paid," Arthur stated, his stance unyielding. "Is it?" Chen's gaze was venomous. He took a step forward, but Arthur didn't budge. "This is not your concern, rancher. This is a matter for our own community. Give her to me now, and there will be no trouble." "Get off my land," Arthur said, the words a final, unshakable command. When Chen's men lunged forward, Arthur moved with a speed that was both shocking and efficient. The fight was brutal and blessedly brief, more a matter of grim necessity than anger. When it was over, Chen and his men were retreating into the darkness, nursing their wounds and shouting threats that were swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. Arthur barred the door, his breathing heavy. He turned to Mai, his face grim. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen the very air from her lungs. He saw that Chen's words, his claim of ownership, had undone all the fragile safety she had found. He had reminded her that in the eyes of the world, she was not a person, but a thing to be owned and traded. She packed her few belongings that evening, her movements stiff and mechanical. A small, embroidered pouch, the repaired slippers, the worn cheongsam. Her logic was twisted by fear, but it was the only logic she had ever known. She believed that love, or whatever this fragile, unnamed thing was that she felt for Arthur, meant leaving before she could be the cause of his destruction. She would not be the storm that broke over his quiet life. He found her by the door, her hand on the latch, a small, determined shadow ready to flee back into the cold. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move to restrain her. He stopped her with a sentence spoken so softly it barely disturbed the air. "You don't owe this town your disappearance," he said. His eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw not pity, but a fierce, unwavering conviction. In that quiet moment, without ceremony or declaration, he was choosing her. He was choosing her over his peace, over his safety, over the unspoken rules of the world they lived in. A massive snowstorm hit that night, a blizzard that swallowed the world whole, burying the landscape under a thick, impenetrable blanket of white. It was as if the heavens themselves had intervened, rendering escape impossible. At dawn, with their supplies running dangerously low, Arthur knew he had to ride out. The town was a perilous journey away, but starvation was a more certain danger. He left her alone with a roaring fire, a loaded rifle, and a heart filled with equal measures of hope and dread. The cabin still held the lingering scent of his coffee and his warmth when Silas Crowder arrived. His presence was heavy and inevitable, like a storm you recognize far too late. He did not knock. The door swung open, and he stood there, a large, imposing figure silhouetted against the swirling snow. He was not a man of subtle threats like Chen. His power was cruder, more direct. He was a wealthy landowner who believed the world was his for the taking. He had seen Mai in town, and like a collector spotting a rare, exotic butterfly, he had decided he wanted her. He spoke of rights and promises, of how a woman like her needed a protector. He spoke of power, his eyes roaming over her in a way that stripped her bare. When she resisted, her voice a fragile tremor in the charged air, he laughed. He took her not with overt violence, but with the terrifying certainty of a man who had never been denied, as if the world had taught him from birth that want was the only permission he required. The cabin stood empty when Arthur returned, the silence screaming louder than any sound. Her shawl lay on the floor where it had fallen, a small, grey square of fabric that looked like a word cut short. A cold, silent panic, more terrifying than any rage, moved through him. There were tracks in the snow, faint but discernible, leading away from the cabin. He didn't hesitate. He mounted Bess, his face a grim mask of determination, and followed the trail into the vast, white emptiness. Devotion, fierce and absolute, drove him faster than thought. He found them at an abandoned line shack miles from his property. The violence that followed was not a brawl, it was a reckoning. It was brief, controlled, and utterly final, more rescue than revenge. He brought her back to the cabin, her body limp and shaking in his arms, a profound, soul-deep silence having fallen over her. That night, the fear and the trauma burned through her veins until she collapsed into a raging fever, leaving him to wonder, in the deepest, loneliest hours of the night, if saving someone was ever truly enough. Ayana drifted in a terrifying twilight world between memory and delirium. The fever took her, and she murmured fragmented phrases in a language he didn't understand, her hands clutching at blankets that weren't there. She cried out names he didn't know and flinched from shadows only she could see. Arthur stayed awake through it all, a steadfast sentinel against the encroaching darkness. He refused sleep as if his vigilance alone could be an anchor to keep her tethered to this world. He bathed her forehead with cool water, the simple act a desperate prayer. He pressed his forehead gently to hers, trying to will his own strength into her. And in the oppressive silence of the sickroom, broken only by her fevered whispers and the howling of the wind, he spoke to her. He whispered reassurances he had never practiced saying aloud, words meant only for her, for this moment. "You're safe now," he murmured over and over, his voice a low, rough anchor in the storm of her illness. "I'm here. I won't let anyone hurt you again." In the darkest hour before dawn, when her breathing was shallow and her skin was alight with a terrifying heat, he thought he was losing her. Overwhelmed by a feeling he couldn't name but couldn't bear to lose, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a soft, reverent touch on her fever-parched lips, a gesture of profound comfort rather than a claim. It was a promise whispered in the language of pure, unadorned tenderness. And outside, the snow fell without pause, a silent, white witness to a love that neither of them had yet found the words to name. By dawn, the fever broke. Her breathing evened out, and a profound stillness settled over her. As he watched the first, pale light of morning touch her sleeping face, something in him settled into a deep, unshakable certainty. The future remained unwritten, a blank, white page like the landscape outside, but he knew, with a conviction that resonated in his very soul, that he would not face it alone. Recovery came slowly, measured not in days, but in small, quiet victories. The first time she was able to sit up on her own. The first time she drank a full cup of broth. The first time a genuine, though fleeting, smile touched her lips. It was a journey they took together, marked by shared glances that held more meaning than entire conversations. When they were finally able to speak of it honestly, the words were hesitant and fractured, but the act of speaking felt like stepping onto solid ground after a long and treacherous crossing. It was in that fragile, honest space that Arthur asked her to be his wife. It was not an offer of rescue, not a transaction born of pity or duty. He offered it as a partnership, a joining of two solitary souls who had found an unlikely home in each other. His hands were open when he asked, just as they had been at the train station, offering a choice, not an obligation. Iona accepted with tears that streamed down her face, tears that carried the weight of her past but were, for the first time, tears of agency, not of gratitude or fear. They were the tears of a woman who was choosing her own future. Sheriff Hale confronted them one last time on the steps of the town's small courthouse, his face a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. He was a man torn between the rigid letter of the law and the undeniable pull of his own conscience. The town, too, divided itself along lines of prejudice and principle that had always existed but had never been so starkly tested. As preparations for the small ceremony began, a strange curiosity lingered in the air, a question hanging unspoken in the winter chill: could a love so defiantly unconventional truly survive being seen? The ceremony was small and reverent, held not in a church, but beneath a vast, pale sky that felt as though the world itself had gone quiet to listen. Snow drifted down in slow, deliberate spirals, settling on shoulders and eyelashes like a benediction rather than a burden. For the first time all winter, the snow did not feel cruel. It felt chosen. Iona stood beside Arthur, her hand in his. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer enormity of being seen, of being chosen, and of choosing to stay. When she lifted her eyes to his, the years of running, of hiding, of being invisible, seemed to loosen their suffocating hold on her breath. The silence around them was profound, broken only by the gentle hush of the falling snow. In that stillness, their heart spoke louder than any gathered witness ever could. Their vows were not grand or poetic, rehearsed for an audience. They were simple, honest, and stripped bare, and in their raw sincerity, they made the very air feel warmer. Arthur's voice, usually so steady, wavered with emotion when he promised her a home that would never demand her disappearance. He promised her his strength, his protection, and his unwavering heart. Iona's tears fell freely, tracing clean paths on her cheeks as she vowed to stand with him, to build a life with him, even when the world turned its face away. Their hands shook as they exchanged simple, hammered tin rings, as if the future itself, vast and unknown, were passing through them. When they pressed their foreheads together, it felt less like a gesture and more like a prayer that had already been answered. Even Sheriff Hale, standing at the edge of the small gathering, felt something in his chest shift, an unaccustomed thawing in a place long frozen by prejudice and duty. He was witnessing something undeniable, a love that could not be argued against or quietly undone by whispers and threats. It simply was. When it was over, when the last words had settled into the snow-covered earth, Arthur kissed his wife. It was a kiss that held both the promise of a shared future and the memory of a desolate train station. It was a kiss that sealed their defiant choice. The few townspeople who had gathered to watch did so in silence, as if witnessing something they had once refused to even imagine. Together, they stepped forward, husband and wife, their footprints marking a single, shared path where there had once been none. And the snowfall closed softly behind them, like a door to a new world, a world they would build together, leaving the old one changed in a way that could never be taken back. After they were married, happiness did not arrive with a flourish of trumpets or a sudden, miraculous ease. It came the way the sun does after a long storm, or the way the snow finally melts in the spring. Quietly, patiently, and with absolute certainty. It wove itself into the fabric of their everyday lives, creating a tapestry of shared moments that became the foundation of their world. Mornings began with the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon, the simple domestic rituals a comforting anchor in the vast wilderness. They would eat at the small pine table, their knees brushing beneath it, a casual intimacy that spoke volumes. Smiles were exchanged over steaming mugs before words found the courage to rise in the early morning quiet. Laughter, a sound that had once been a stranger in the cabin, began to warm its corners, chasing away the lingering ghosts of loneliness. When Arthur brushed snow from Iona's hair after she came in from the cold, he did it slowly, with a deliberate tenderness, as though each delicate snowflake were a vow he intended to keep for the rest of his life. In those moments, she would close her eyes, a gesture of complete and utter trust. She was trusting not just his hands, but the future they were building together, one quiet moment at a time. The hostile world beyond their window, with its harsh judgments and cold stares, felt very far away. In the evenings, she would often sing while he mended tack by the warm glow of the lamplight. The melodies were soft and haunting, songs from a life he would never know, from a land he would never see. Her voice wove itself into the very wood and stone of the cabin, becoming as much a part of the home as the fire in the hearth, a gentle memory that lingered even after the song had ended. Arthur would pause in his work sometimes, his hands still, just to listen. A tightness would grip his chest, a powerful, protective tenderness he had never learned how to name. He would watch the woman who had once slept on a frozen bench, a ghost at the edge of the world, now moving with a quiet, confident grace through the rooms of his heart. When she caught him looking, her lips would curve into a shy, knowing smile, and he would reach for her hand across the small space between them, as if the simple, solid act of holding it could keep time from stealing anything precious. Slowly, imperceptibly, the cabin ceased to be merely a refuge from the world. It became a world unto itself, a sanctuary that the outside world could not touch. And that transformation felt like a state of grace. The town's whispers did not vanish overnight. Prejudice, like a deep winter frost, takes a long time to thaw. But eventually, the whispers softened, and then, for the most part, they fell away. Not because the people of Redemption suddenly had a grand revelation of tolerance, but because Arthur and Iona's love proved itself to be steadier and more enduring than their judgment. Its quiet persistence was a force they could not deny. They walked through the rest of that winter, and the many winters that followed, side by side. They were no longer afraid of the cold, for they had learned to find warmth in shared glances, in hands that instinctively found each other, in the thousands of unspoken promises that made up a marriage. A deep and lasting peace settled over them like a second snowfall, one that was gentle, enduring, and, above all, earned. As the snow continued to fall year after year, it seemed to slow time itself around their small piece of the world, giving them the space to love each other fully, deeply, and without apology, as though the world had finally learned to breathe at the same patient, steady pace as their hearts. Years later, winter still returned as faithfully as breath, and the snow still fell upon the land, blanketing the mountains and the plains in a familiar, pristine white. But it no longer felt like something to be survived. It felt familiar, almost tender, as if the cold itself had learned their names and now greeted them as old friends. Arthur's hair had silvered at the temples, and fine lines, etched by laughter and worry, fanned out from the corners of his eyes. Iona's laughter, once a rare and fragile thing, now carried a rich, resonant depth, shaped by years of being unconditionally cherished. Yet when they stood together at the cabin window, watching the first snowfall of the season, their hands still found each other with the same quiet, unerring certainty they had on their wedding day. Love had not softened them into complacency. It had steadied them. It had forged a strength in them that was both resilient and gentle, teaching their hearts how to endure the harshest of seasons without hardening. That profound truth lived in every shared glance across the dinner table, in every unspoken understanding that passed between them in the comfortable silence of their evenings. Their life together was a mosaic made of small, luminous acts of devotion. It was in the way Arthur still rose before dawn every winter morning to build the fire in the stove, so that the creeping cold would never touch her first. It was in the way Iona would rest her head against his shoulder as they sat by the fire, a simple, trusting gesture that communicated a world of safety and belonging. It was the safest place the world had ever offered her, and it always would be. They did not speak often of the past, of the train station or of the men who had tried to claim her. They did not need to. That past lived gently in their profound care for one another, its sharp edges worn smooth by time and tenderness. The wounds had been transformed into a quiet wisdom, a deep understanding of the fragility and preciousness of the life they had built. What they had now required no witnesses, no town approval, no sheriff's reluctant acceptance. It required only time, and even time, that relentless thief, seemed to move more slowly around them, reluctant to disturb a love so patiently and bravely earned. If you were to listen closely, the old soul telling this story might lean toward you here, their voice lowered not in secrecy, but in reverence. They would remind you that love is never about possession. It is, and always has been, about shelter offered freely. It is the quiet, profound recognition that says, I see you, all of you, and you may stay. It is the courage to choose kindness when cruelty would be so much easier, the grace to open your hands in offering instead of closing them into a fist. And it is the unwavering faith to offer your own coat to a stranger in the cold, trusting that sometimes, the truest, most enduring love begins exactly there, unfolding quietly and unexpectedly in the snow, where only the heart can truly hear.